The empire that had swept from the Hijaz to the Atlantic and to the Indus was now, suddenly, a house of many doors, and none of them closed. When Yazid's short, troubled reign ended in 683, the Caliphate did not pass smoothly into the hands of a single successor. Instead, it cracked open. In Damascus, the loyalists stumbled. In Kufa, old resentments flared. In Egypt, local leaders hesitated. In the holy cities, the air filled with defiance. What followed was not merely a struggle for a throne. It was a conflict about legitimacy, memory, and the soul of the Muslim community itself, a long, brutal chapter that historians call the Second Civil War, al-Fitna, al-thaniya. When Yazid died, his son briefly took the title, but he too would vanish from the scene. What remained was a vacuum, and wherever there is a vacuum, power rushes in. In Mecca, the sanctuary city, a man named Abdullah ibn al-Zubayr, a figure of sober reputation descended from the earliest generation of Muslims, did not hide his unease at what had been permitted in the name of the Caliphate. He had stood openly against Yazid. Now, with the central authority weakened, leaders and provinces who had never completely accepted Umayyad rule saw a chance. From Iraq to the Hijaz, voices that had been silenced now spoke of a return to a purer form of leadership, one based not on dynastic inheritance, but on the dignity of the office and the piety of its holder. Ibn al-Zubayr's rise was not the work of a single speech. It was a slow gathering of momentum. In Mecca, he declared his refusal to give allegiance to Yazid. After the death of Yazid, he was increasingly recognized as the rightful leader by large parts of the Islamic world. Kufa and Basra in Iraq, always the hotbed of political life, swung in his favor. Egypt in time followed, and even the Hijaz, the land of the Prophet, lent him its moral weight. For a moment, it seemed the Umayyads were finished. Damascus, once the heart of a vast polity, had shrunk to the edges of its former authority. But power has a way of surviving when it concentrates itself. Syria, the Umayyads' strongest province, did not crumble. There, among families who had most to lose from political chaos, an elder statesman named Marwan ibn al-Hakam stepped forward. Marwan was no revolutionary. He was a survivor. He had been a companion to the old order, a man schooled in the hard, practical business of politics. In the chaos of 684, when Damascus seemed on the brink, Marwan became the focal point for those who preferred unity, even if achieved by force of arms. His reputation mattered. He was of Quraysh lineage, familiar with the ways of tribal negotiation, and he knew Syria's leading families and their grievances. When those families rallied around him, not because they loved him, but because they feared fragmentation more, the Umayyad cause found a spine. The decisive moment came at Marj Rahit, a dusty plain outside Damascus in 684. The battle that unfolded there was less a clash of empires than a collision of tribal loyalties. On one side stood Marwan and a coalition of Syrian tribes, people determined to keep Syria together and to restore an authority that could defend it. On the other stood a confederation that included partisans of Ibn al-Zubayr and various tribal groups who felt wronged or marginalized. The fighting was fierce and personal. Men fought beside cousins and against old friends, and ancient tribal memories shaped modern politics. In the end, Marwan prevailed. His victory did not bring immediate peace across the Caliphate, but it did secure the Umayyads a narrow, stubborn base in Syria. That base would prove crucial. From it would rise the mechanics of a restored and later reconstituted Umayyad state. Inevitably, Iraq remained the fault line. The old capital of Kufa, the center of Ali's support, and a city with a long tradition of political ferment, refused to stay quiet. The Kufans who had once written to Hussein inviting him to lead them were now actors in a new drama. Loyalties shifted as quickly as the desert wind. Into this maelstrom stepped a man named Mukhtar ibn Abi Ubaid, a charismatic and ruthless figure who seized Kufa in 685 and proclaimed he would avenge Husayn ibn Ali. Mukhtar's uprising was complex. It drew from genuine grief and rage over Karbala and from ambitions and alliances that sometimes seemed contradictory. He claimed to act in the name of Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiya, a son of Ali, and for a while his authority was real. His forces hunted down men they portrayed as the perpetrators of Karbala, and their vengeance, real or imagined, altered the political map of Iraq. Mukhtar's movement, violent and ideologically charged, showed how the memory of Karbala had become a mobilizing force. Grief transformed into politics, and grief into power. This region, fractured, passionate, and often unpredictable, was the theater in which the next struggle played out. Marwan's victory in Syria bought the Umayyads time, but it did not give them the whole kingdom back. What the Umayyads needed was a unifying figure who could consolidate support and rebuild institutions. In 685, after Marwan's brief reign, his son Abd al-Malik took the reins. Abd al-Malik was not a man of theatrical charisma. He was methodical, patient, and above all, clear-eyed about the measures necessary to keep an empire together. He understood that military victories alone could not hold a fractured polity. Administration, money, the rhetoric of legitimacy, and even the language of the state would have to be reshaped. To reforge the caliphate, Abd al-Malik first had to end the competition. Ibn al-Zubayr still held the Hijaz and much of the Arab world's moral authority. He had been recognized by many as caliph, and he sat within the sacred precincts of Mecca, which gave his claim a spiritual weight few could ignore. He governed with a reputation for piety and justice. His name reawakened the early ideals of the community for many who had watched the caliphate drift from its ideals. Abd al-Malik's solution was to combine the sword and the diplomat's patience. He rebuilt the Umayyad military apparatus, secured Syrian tribal support more deeply, and crucially, entrusted the suppression of Ibn al-Zubayr's revolt to one of his most formidable lieutenants, al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf. Al-Hajjaj was fearsome, unyielding, and utterly devoted to the restoration of central authority. He was the man who would carry out Abd al-Malik's designs with relentless energy. The campaign against Mecca culminated in 692. It was not an easy choice for Abd al-Malik. To strike at Mecca, to bring the tools of siege against the city that housed the Kaaba, the direction of Muslim prayer, was to transgress a hallowed boundary. Yet Abd al-Malik and his commanders judged that allowing rival caliphs to persist would doom the unity of the realm. The siege that followed would be remembered as one of the most wrenching events of the age, Muslims firing upon the sanctuary that had stood as a place of refuge and pilgrimage through generations. Ibn al-Zubayr resisted with determination. From the ramparts of the sacred precinct, he refused to yield. His defense was not merely military, it was moral. He was, in many regions, the face of principled opposition to what his supporters regarded as illegitimate rule. His standing came not only from piety but from sheer stubbornness. He shaped himself as the defender of the sanctity of the Hijaz, of a model of leadership that refused to bow to dynastic claims. For weeks, the siege dragged on. Catapults and engines pounded at the city, and stones struck the Kaaba itself. Fire marred its coverings, ash fell where once pilgrims had knelt in reverence. For Muslims across the empire, the sight was unbearable. The destruction was not merely physical, it was symbolic, a rupture in the sense of sacred inviolability that had been one of the pillars of Arab and Islamic life. Yet the siege's end would not be glorious for Ibn al-Zubayr. Betrayed or overwhelmed, sources differ in particulars, and the heat of memory often complicates the contours of truth. He was killed in Mecca, his struggle extinguished amid the stones of the sanctuary he had hoped to protect. With Ibn al-Zubayr's death, the Second Civil War reached a decisive close. The Umayyads, battered but resented, regained the outer trappings of power. Abd al-Malik, having shown he could be ruthless, turned now to the harder labor of holding an empire together. He began to reorganize the fiscal systems. He instituted measures to stabilize coinage. He standardized administration. He used Syrian troops and bureaucrats as the skeleton of a renewed state. His aim was not simply to win, it was to make victory durable. Yet the settlement came at a cost. The wounds left by years of fratricidal conflict did not heal overnight. The social fabric, especially in Iraq and the Hijaz, had been torn. Memories of Karbala, of Mukhtar's retributions, of the martyrdom of Hussein, and of the siege of Mecca haunted public consciousness. Political memory is stubborn. Families mourned sons and fathers, and tribal grudges that had hardened in the war would resurface for generations. Even as Abd al-Malik strengthened the central apparatus, he did so in part by narrowing the avenues through which opposition might express itself. Political dissent found fewer and fewer institutional channels. The center, once more secure, was less tolerant than before. The Second Civil War also left a lasting imprint on how legitimacy would be spoken about. The Umayyads emerged convinced that the rhetorical language of authority, ceremonies, coin legends, official narratives, mattered. The caliph was no longer simply the leader of a pious community. He was also a monarch who minted coins, reformed the bureaucracy, and asserted the administrative grammar of rule. This did not happen in a single decree. It was the quiet accretion of practice, of law, of fiscal reform, of patronage networks and military pay. But the effect was profound. The caliphate moved further away from the early, more fluid practices of selection and consultation, and closer to the structures of a durable dynasty. At the human level, the Second Civil War taught harsh lessons about the fragility of political order. It revealed that no grand narrative, the unity of the Ummah, the sanctity of the Caliphate, could by itself prevent fragmentation when local, personal and tribal grievances were strong enough. It showed how memory and mourning could be weaponized, and how theology could be recruited into political contests. And it showed something else, quieter but no less important. That legitimacy has two sources. One is the sword and the office, the other is remembrance and moral authority. Ibn al-Zubayr's claim failed as a political project when confronted with military power, but it did not disappear from the moral imagination of the community. Mukhtar's brief reign in Kufa ended in blood, but the reasons people rallied behind him, grief and the thirst for accountability after Karbala, did not vanish. When the dust settled, the Umayyad state that remained was stronger in certain ways, and yet scarred in others. al-Malik's centralization made for more efficient governance. His reforms would enable the Umayyads to rule for decades more. But the cost had been high. The Caliphate's claim to moral spontaneity had been eroded, and the political culture became more rigid and more dependent on coercion. The lines between piety and politics blurred irrevocably. If there is a single image that captures this period, it is not a king on a throne nor a general on a battlefield, but a city, Mecca, ringing with the noise of engines of war while its pilgrims hide. It is an image that repels and yet compels, because it forces us to see how even the sacred can be dragged into the calculus of power. And it is here, in the tension between the sacred and the political, that the Second Civil War left its deepest legacy. The realization that the shape of authority in the Muslim world would no longer be purely the product of communal consent, nor purely the result of charismatic piety, but something forged in the crucible of force, finance, and administration. The chronicles remember the battles, the sieges, the names of generals and caliphs. But the real story, the human story, is the grinding of ordinary lives in the gears of history, the traders whose caravans were cut off, the women who mourned in private courtyards, the soldiers who fought beside men who had once been their neighbors. This was the price paid to knit an empire back together. And yet beneath the grief and the ruin, there remained threads of hope. The very fact that voices like Ibn al-Zubayr's could still be heard, that men like Mukhtar could mobilize crowds in the name of justice, showed that the moral imagination of the community was not dead. It would find new forms. It would shape later debates about leadership, about the scope of power, and about the rights of those who were governed. The Second Civil War ended not with a grand reconciliation, but with a reordering. A new center at Damascus which had learned both to rule and to fear the consequences of failing to do so. It taught future rulers the language of administration and the limits of legitimacy. It also left behind a memory that would be rehearsed, invoked, and mourned through the centuries, a memory that would give rise to rituals, to poetry, and to a potent moral vocabulary. In that vocabulary, Hussein's name still stands luminous, Ibn al-Zubayr's stubbornness is still remembered, and the battles of those years still instruct the living on the cost of political division. The Umayyads survived, but survival had a price. The caliphate that reassembled itself after the Fitnah was administratively firmer, but the moral fabric of the early community had been stretched in ways that no legislation could fully repair. For the Muslims who followed, the Second Civil War became both a warning and a mirror. It reminded them that power once claimed must be wielded with care, and that when power forgets its duties, the very sanctities on which a community rests can be put at risk.